Hi friends, I hope all is well. I was inspired by the design idea from yesterday's collage, but I'm changing it up a bit. This is a perfect example of why I like having a sketchbook practice. One collage sketch idea can inspire another. Especially working in a smaller sketchbook, these ideas can be executed quickly with limited time. By the way, I'm still working in the Strathmore sketchbook and using matte Mod Podge for the glue. This collage will have a vertical composition. I pulled mostly dark value narrow shape papers or smaller papers that can be cut into this shape. I didn't want to do too much cutting due to the time constraint I had on this day. My initial plan was to use the papers on the right for the first layer, then cover it with a thin coat of paint, then use the papers on the left side for the final layer. You'll see soon that I had to change this plan. I wasn't too concerned that the papers on this layer worked well together. I focused on whether the papers would be visible under a layer of paint. I'm going to put music on for the rest of this section and come back for the next step. As I mentioned on day 10, I like using off-white acrylic paint instead of white paint because white is too bright for my preference when I'm trying to tone down artwork. Also, I prefer to use matte acrylic paint when working in my sketchbook when possible. The matte acrylic paint is less likely to cause the pages to stick together when the sketchbook is closed. I want this layer of paint to be on the thin side so you can see the outline of the papers underneath along with the hints of color. I realized the papers I initially pulled worked well underneath the thin layer of paint, but will not work on top of the painted layer. There wasn't enough color and value contrast. These papers needed to be mid to light value. I'm checking to see which paper options to keep and which ones need to be put aside. I brought out my leftover scraps container to pull additional papers. I'm being thoughtful of the papers I'll be using for this layer. Besides ones that are mid to light value, I'm limiting the color palette to blue, yellow, and orange. I wasn't too concerned about the shape of these papers. I can cut them into narrow shapes. I'm starting by placing the yellow and orange papers down first. These papers contrasted the most with the papers underneath the paint layer. I wanted to use the ones that were already in a narrow shape first if possible, but I was mindful of varying the widths. Also using papers that had different values: dark orange that's almost red, mid to light orange, and yellow. The blue papers will be used sparingly as accents and in an odd number, which is visually pleasing to me. I'll add music and come back once the collage is finished. I'm noticing with these daily sketches that I've been creating a lot of collages that are leaning towards light value, which is different for me. I tend to create dark to mid-tone value collages. In evaluating this collage, overall I like it. If I do recreate it, I'll probably add a thicker layer of the off-white paint to tone down the first collage layer a bit more. Also, I'd like to add more dark orange or even red elements on top. Here's the grayscale version. Let's go on to day 12. I didn't have a lot of time again on this day, so I grabbed mostly leftover scraps in a limited color palette and a glue stick. I was thinking about creating a fast, simple design. It helps that I'm still working in the Strathmore sketchbook. These two wonky dome-shaped elements will be the focal point for this collage. They'll be glued down last, but I will keep both on this page so I can visually see how the papers that will be glued down underneath will look. Also, the area I want to place these elements may change once the ground layer is done. There isn't a lot of space on this 8.5 by 5.5 inch page, but the placement of it will be slightly off-center. I prefer this placement instead of center. I think that off-center placement is more visually pleasing. I will choose papers that keep the focus on this dome shape. My plan is to have papers that were mostly light value with patterns in dark to mid tones. I mainly use papers in my collage practice that I either paint or monoprint, but I do like to add other paper ephemera like these security envelope scraps and the brown UPS envelope scrap. Both types of envelopes are getting harder to find since correspondence is mostly electronic. To add interest to the ground layer, I'm placing some of the elements at a slight diagonal along with vertical and horizontal. This is stamped tissue paper that has a layer of acrylic medium. I used to put a layer of acrylic medium on tissue paper before stamping or painting or monoprinting on top. It was suggested to me because it was supposed to make the paper or ink adhere better to the tissue paper. I have since stopped doing this extra step. I'll link videos in the description box that show how I apply ink and paint to tissue paper. One video is when I apply the acrylic medium first, and the other video is where I paint directly onto the tissue paper. I prefer to use a gloss or matte medium to glue transparent papers like this stamped tissue paper. I tried using a glue stick, but it was hard to apply the glue to the back of the tissue paper. Also, the medium helps to keep the transparency of the paper so you can see the papers underneath it. As I was replacing the dome shape on the page, I wanted to see how it would look if the domes were reversed. Another reason why it's best to leave the top elements unglued. At this point, I hadn't decided which orientation I liked better. At this point, I had decided that I liked the smaller dome on the bottom and the bigger dome on the top. It gave an unbalanced element to the design, which I like. Usually, larger elements are placed below the smaller elements. The top area looked a bit plain to me. It only had a very light security envelope scrap. I chose this bubble wrap red stamp paper to balance the red elements, and it had mid and light values. This collage is a good example of how a limited color palette can create a successful collage. I love how the two different sizes and shaped domes came together to create the focal point. Here's the grayscale version. Let's go on to day 13. I've been wanting to use this purple scrap since I started this daily practice this month, but I couldn't come up with a design until this day. To keep it as the focal point, I didn't pull any other purple papers, only greens and oranges. I did want another element with a center circle cut out, so I decided on another dark value paper. This dark green element will be smaller in size so it doesn't compete with the purple focal point. My design plan is to have the elements interlock with each other. Having the purple focal point interlock with the green element is the first one. This orange dot paper is the other one. Having three interlocking elements takes up most of the surface. I had to make some adjustments to make sure all three elements fit, like trimming off part of an edge or cutting an element in half. I started gluing these elements in place because the other part of the design was to have some of the white paper showing. Also, I knew it'd be a bit tricky to glue the interlocking elements because they have to be glued at the same time. It took some maneuvering. There was a bit more white showing than I like, so I added a few elements in orange and bright green. I'll add music and come back once the collage is finished. Same thing as day 12's collage. It's another good example of how a limited color palette can produce a successful collage. It's hard for me to leave any of the white paper showing, but it did add a nice detail. Here's the grayscale version that shows that all three values were represented and it's balanced. Now on to day 14. I'm going back to a muted, grungier color palette for this next collage. This monoprinted paper was the inspiration. This muted lavender and green color combination is one that I gravitate towards. The grungy, imperfect print is another reason why I like it. The monoprinted paper underneath it is another good print in this color combination. I wanted to use a good amount of each of these papers, so I decided on a horizontal composition. The papers on the left side of the Strathmore sketchbook will be used for the band of horizontal elements that will be grouped together. You may have noticed that I put a piece of paper behind the page I'm working on. When I was using liquid adhesive on previous collages in this sketchbook, the page behind the one I was working on got stuck. I wanted to avoid that happening when I'm using liquid adhesives. Since these two papers are large, it's a good idea to use a smoothing tool to make sure every section of the paper is glued to the sketchbook page. I trimmed the edges so I had a better view of the size of the finished surface. This helps when placing the horizontal band of elements, which is what I'm doing next. Since the two large elements are mid to light value, I'm starting with adding elements using this black and white circles monoprinted paper. It will add a much needed dark value. Going forward, the papers will have mid to dark values. The shapes of the elements will be different. Because it's a horizontal composition, it's not necessary to have long, narrow elements. The black and white circles is a good example of how an angular shape fits into a horizontal band of elements. I will include long, narrow elements as well. I'll add music and come back once the collage is finished. A good example of a simple design collage with a muted, grungier color palette. I like the different sizes and shapes of the elements in the horizontal band. You can see the strong contrast in the grayscale version. Let's go on to the final collage for this video. I brought out the spineless 8.5 by 11 inch sketchbook because I wanted to use the two multi-layer painted papers that I made back in September. I filmed that tutorial, so I'll put a link to that video in the description area. These papers are large, so I wanted the surface to be big enough to accommodate the size of the elements that I wanted to use. This color palette of pink, red, black, and gray reminds me of the 80s. I wore those colors together all the time. Does anyone else have a color palette that reminds them of a time in their lives? As you can tell, I'm using a vertical composition again. When I want to showcase large sections of papers, then I typically use either vertical, horizontal, or diagonal compositions. These types of compositions lend themselves to displaying larger elements. There are some really interesting patterns on these larger papers, so I want to use as much of it as possible. I am including that black paper as well. Sometimes it's needed to have an area where the viewer's eyes can rest. It's not completely solid black because there's some unpainted white paper showing, but it will work as well as a completely solid painted paper. This collage design is pretty straightforward. I will include elements with different widths and lengths, also pattern and solid elements. I'll add music at this point and come back once it's finished. I know I'm biased because the color palette is nostalgic for me, but this vertical composition collage turned out well. It's a simple design, but it's balanced and cohesive. Here's the grayscale version, which could work as well as the color version. The next video in this series will include collages from days 16 through 20. I'll link the other videos in this series in the description box. Let me know if you have any questions. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch this video. See you soon. Take care.